Buried in soot, a wedding veil waits. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Your voices give life to these stories. The mystery awaits. It was the sort of morning St. Mary Mead did best. Pale sunlight on frost-tipped hedgerows, smoke curling lazily from cottage chimneys, and the faint toll of the church bell announcing the day's first wedding rehearsal. The village, as always, had turned the occasion into a minor spectacle. Mrs. Cartwright had stationed herself by the green with her knitting, ostensibly just passing the time, though her eyes seldom left the vicarage gates. Mr. Taverner, who claimed not to care for weddings at all, had made a slow circuit past the church 3 times already. The bride-to-be, Clara Winfield, was something of a local favourite, a bright, pretty girl with a fresh, open face, the daughter of the late Colonel Winfield and his quietly capable widow. Her marriage to Michael Harrington, whose family owned much of the surrounding farmland, was widely seen as a solid match. Invitations had been whispered about weeks in advance, and though not everyone would be inside the church on the big day, no one intended to miss the spectacle from the lane. Miss Marple, seated primly by her parlour window with a view of the high street, sipped her morning tea as she watched the flurry of small excitements. She was fond of weddings in her own quiet way, though experience had long ago taught her that such occasions could stir up more than romance. In a village, joy often sat cheek by jowl with envy, old grievances, and awkward reminders of the past. By 10:30, a commotion began at the rear of the churchyard. It was the sort of noise that makes heads turn even when no one can quite place it. A cluster of raised voices, the scuff of hurried boots on frosty gravel. Within moments, young Peter Lyle, the verger's grandson, came tearing around from the back path, his cheeks red not only from the cold. "They found something, Gran!" he blurted to Mrs. Lyle, who had been arranging chrysanthemums near the gate. "In the coal shed behind the hall. Something odd." "What kind of odd?" Mrs. Lyle asked, her hands still clutching the flowers. "A veil," Peter said, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. "A wedding veil, all stuffed in under the coal, and it's got marks on it." By the time the vicar himself appeared to confirm the strange find, word had already leapt across the green, down the high street, and into Miss Marple's sitting room via Mrs. Cartwright's purposeful knock. "I thought you ought to hear it directly," Mrs. Cartwright said breathlessly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "The bride's veil, in the coal shed. And not just that. They say it's torn, and there's, well, some say stains." Miss Marple set down her teacup, her eyes thoughtful. "How very singular," she murmured, as though speaking to herself. But in truth, she was already considering the curious business of how a bridal veil might find itself among the coal dust, and what such a thing might mean in a village where nothing, not even love, happened without a reason. The news of the veil moved through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar efficiency of village air, which seems to carry not only sound but meaning. By the time Miss Marple buttoned her cardigan and took up her walking stick, more a habit than a necessity, the cluster at the vicarage had matured into a thicket of opinions. Mrs. Cartwright, loyal to her station on the green, had collected theories like a woman filling a basket with windfalls, boys playing a prank, a jealous girl, Clara herself in a fit of nerves. Each theory, unripe and bruised, was nonetheless inspected with relish, shared in half-whispers, and set aside for something more sensational. Miss Marple preferred to look rather than pronounce. The back path, white with frost where the sun hadn't reached, led past the church hall to the coal shed, little more than a lean-to with a warped door and a padlock that, to Miss Marple's eye, looked newer than its surroundings. Peter Lyle, presently inflated by important errands, went prancing to and fro between the shed and his grandmother. He caught sight of Miss Marple and gave a quick, respectful nod, as boys who have once been fed seed cake in a pleasant parlour will do for the rest of their lives. The vicar, a mild man whose spectacles always threatened to slide off the end of his nose, hovered near the shed, speaking in low tones to Mr. Lyle himself, the verger, who had the put-upon look of someone blamed for the weather. "I didn't put it there, did I?" Mr. Lyle protested to the world in general. "Coals delivered on Tuesdays. Vale's got no business in it. Keys kept on a hook by the vestry. No one touches them but me and the vicar, and sometimes Peter if I send him." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the hook by the vestry door, where a single, paint-chipped key hung companionably with a length of string and a tarnished whistle. She had a tidy memory for small arrangements, whether a teapot's cosy was knitted or crocheted, the order people chose for their morning errands, the little substitutes one made when one was trying not to be noticed. She had, for instance, always noticed that when the Women's Institute used the hall, they fetched the key themselves, and when the bell ringers came, it was invariably one of the young men, cheerful, hatted, and with a hand like a shovel, who had possession of it. The key, Miss Marple thought, had a social life. Mrs. Winfield arrived just then, with Clara at her side, and immediately all the eyes that had been trained on the shed turned with a rustle to the bride. Clara's face, usually a composition of quick smiles and pink in the cheeks, had lost its colour, and she stood very still as though motion might make the situation worse. Her mother, in contrast, had the steady manner of a woman who has brought children through illnesses and households through shortages, and will not, thank you, be unseated by a piece of lace and tulle. "It's the veil your aunt lent," Mrs. Winfield murmured, receiving what the vicar offered, an account rather than the object itself. "From her own wedding. You remember how particular she is about it, Clara. We shall need to make it right straight away." Clara's lips formed a little O, and Miss Marple, who was near enough to hear the breath in it, thought it contained not only distress, but a certain, what was the word? Dread. That interested her. Dread was not for lace. Dread was for consequence. Michael Harrington came striding up a moment later, his hair still damp as if he had pushed his head under a tap before setting out. He took Clara's hands and looked over her shoulder at the gathering like a farmer sizing a sky before harvest. Behind him, his mother advanced with a measured pace and an expression that said the day had offended her. Mrs. Harrington was one of those women whose good deeds made her formidable. She ran committees the way a colonel runs a regiment, and her presence always introduced the hope that someone else would do the talking. "I do wish," she said into the air, "that people would not crowd. This is neither helpful nor edifying." Then, to Clara, with a softened tone for those who were listening, "My dear, you mustn't let childish mischief upset you. We have a rehearsal in half an hour. Where is the veil now?" "At the shed," said the vicar helplessly. "We thought it best not to move it until we were sure what we were dealing with." "Coal dust," pronounced Mrs. Harrington, "and a tear which can be mended. Anything else is gossip. There are, in every village, persons whose denial is as good as a confession, if not for guilt, then for anxiety." Miss Marple, whose experience included not only human nature, but also the delicate business of church flowers, and whose vase belonged beside the Harringtons just as surely as port belongs beside pudding, made a note of the tone. It was not outrage for the veil itself, it was irritation for the disturbance. Gossip, meanwhile, had found its legs and run ahead. Mr. Taverner leaned on the low wall and confided to Mrs. Cartwright that he'd seen a certain young fellow cut across the churchyard after dark on Thursday, which was the very night the choir had stayed late to rehearse the anthem. From there, the tale hopped over to the butcher's counter, where the suggestion became an assertion. Dickie Pratt, a bell ringer with hair too long and manners too short, had been seen slipping round the back, and didn't he have a soft look for Clara once upon a time? By the time it reached the post office, Dickie had not only slipped round the back, but also carried a bundle, and at the tea shop it was a sack with a veil-shaped corner. Miss Marple listened to these additions accumulate like snow on a branch, and thought of how villages confuse presence with purpose. Many a cat goes past a dairy, few steal cream. She did not contradict anyone. Instead, she walked, unhurried, to the shed itself and asked the vicar if she might take a look, only for the sake of my curiosity, which is a stubborn, old-fashioned thing and not easily put off. Inside, the veil lay draped across a slanted coal scuttle, as though a peculiar hand had tried to tuck it out of sight and thought better of it. The tier was clean, a graceful wound along the edge, where lace became net. Coal dust freckled the fabric. More intimate stains, brown and stiff as if time had set them, marked a patch midway down. Miss Marple bent without touching and sniffed lightly. She did not think of murder. It was too early for that, and she had long ago learned that words, once used, refused to be taken back. But she thought of the sharp scent of iron and the duller domestic smell of spilled port, and the way men and women alike underestimated the fact that a veil collects stories as a hedgerow collects burrs. "Very distressing," she said, and the vicar, grateful for something sensible, echoed, "Very." On her way out, she detained Peter with that gentle precision old ladies have when speaking to boys. Had he found it alone? No. Old Mr. Taverner had sent him for kindling, and he had gone to the wrong door and seen a corner of white under the coal. Was the shed locked when he went? He thought so. He had fetched the key from its hook because Gran said never to be in a shed without a key. Had the lock been stiff? Yes, it had squeaked, and that made him proud because it meant care, and he had bent the key a little trying to turn it. He showed Miss Marple the small curve in the metal, the sort that comes from force rather than time. She said, "How clever of you, Peter," and let him stand a fraction taller. By noon, the village had produced 3 sensible explanations and 10 absurd ones. The sensible: a prank, a fox, or cat's nest robbery confused in the dark. A drunken lark by a farmhand who hadn't realised what he was tucking under coal until morning shame prevented retrieval. The absurd: a gypsy curse, though there had been no gypsies this year. A warning from an old flame. Dickie was not old enough to qualify as anything but a warm ember, and a sign from above that the wedding should not proceed. People who preferred the absurd held to it as a drunk holds a lamppost. Clara, for her part, kept close to her mother. Once, when she thought herself unobserved, she pressed a hand to her middle and swallowed hard. Miss Marple, who had seen brides consume more anxiety than sandwiches, wondered whether Clara's dread pointed backward rather than forward. She also wondered about the aunt to whom the veil belonged. Was this an aunt on the Winfield side or Mrs. Harrington's? The former would make the stain a family worry, the latter a political one. She did not have to wait long for clarification. At the tea shop, where Miss Hartnell and Miss Weatherby were dividing a currant bun with a degree of exactness that would have impressed a surveyor, Mrs. Harrington's own voice, unmistakable, arose from the next table, informing Mrs. Price Ridley that the veil was Harrington property, on generous loan, and that it would have been safer if it had been stored in the Harringtons' linen chest as originally suggested. "One never knows," Mrs. Harrington concluded, "how things are kept elsewhere," which was to say, the Winfields were of good family, but not quite Harringtons. Miss Marple did not agree about linen chests. She had seen things go missing from the most thorough households and remain forever present in the careless ones. But she filed away the tiny barb all the same, for barbs have a way of attracting other iron filings in their vicinity. At 2, the rehearsal commenced, and the church, which had been a repository for speculation, returned to its ordinary holiness. The verger had swept, the coal shed was closed and its key replaced, and Clara walked the aisle with mechanical grace, as if she were a music box that needed only winding. Michael, attentive and uncharacteristically quiet, watched her as a man watches a skylark taking flight. Admiration mixed with fear that something might startle it. The vicar stumbled over the Harringtons' middle names, apologised, and smiled at no one in particular. Miss Marple observed from a side pew that the bridesmaid, Lydia Grant, a lively creature with a fashion for hats that could not be reconciled with her income, had red-rimmed eyes and that she avoided looking at Michael. She also observed that when the rehearsal broke, Dickie Pratt appeared at the porch, cap in hand, with the expression of a boy caught behind the chicken coop. He asked after Clara in a tone that was meant to be bluff and was therefore tender. Michael thanked him coolly. It was not the coolness of jealousy, but of a man who sees a path over trodden ground and has no desire to go that way. The day would have ended with this uneasy truce. Villagers put out, families attempting dignity, Miss Marple thinking of keys and squeaks, and the way new locks sit on old doors, if not for the small additional matter of the gloves. Mrs. Lyle found them tucked behind the second hymn book in the front left pew, where the Harringtons usually sat. White satin, the sort a bride wears to the church and removes for the ring. Not Clara's, Mrs. Winfield said the instant they were produced, too quickly for a mother interested only in accuracy. Mrs. Harrington declared gloves unimportant and asked for a broom to remove any lingering dust from the centre aisle. Miss Marple, on her way out, paused to look at those gloves. One had a smear across the thumb, faint and oval, as if someone, adjusting a veil, with hands none too clean, had left the quiet signature of their presence. She said nothing aloud. She only thought of a girl from years ago, a parlour-maid with her laced gloves turning grey where they met the doorknobs, and of how some stains arrive by accident while others come, slowly and on purpose, out of a heart's decision. Then she went home for her tea, which had surely grown stewed on the hob, and allowed the village to settle around the idea that mischief had been done and would, in time, be explained. Yet as shadows lengthened, Miss Marple knew that explanations are like puddles in winter. They harden on the surface, while the water beneath still runs. Someone had wanted the veil seen under coal, not simply hidden there. Someone had chosen a place of clang and dust, of public keys and private errands, and someone had worn gloves that did not belong to the bride, gloves good enough to keep fingerprints at bay, but not clever enough to remain out of sight. All that, in her experience, pointed not to a boy's prank, but to a mind looking to bruise without breaking. She sat by her window once more, the high street quiet and respectable, and waited, as one does in the early acts of a village drama, for the next small, telling thing to happen. The gloves were still on Miss Marple's mind the following morning, though she knew better than to mention them openly. In a place like St. Mary Mead, a word misplaced could travel faster than a motor car and return altered beyond recognition. She contented herself with a short errand to the post office, which, on a Saturday, served less as a conduit for mail than as a convenient listening post for whatever matter currently occupied the village's imagination. She was not disappointed. Mrs. Price Ridley was there ahead of her, addressing a parcel in a hand that looked determined to make itself legible and speaking to the postmistress in tones that would have carried across the green if the door had been open. "It's the principle, you see," she was saying. "One doesn't expect such things in St. Mary Mead. If it were London, well, London has its ways. But here, and just before a wedding, it speaks to a decline. That's what I say." The postmistress, who had long ago learned that agreeing in general terms was the quickest way to end such discourses, nodded sympathetically. Mrs. Price Ridley lowered her voice to what she no doubt thought was a confidential murmur, but which in fact reached Miss Marple quite clearly. Between ourselves, I've heard the veil was not only torn but soiled, and not with coal. They say blood. Miss Marple let her eyes widen slightly, as though this were new to her. In truth, she had suspected as much from the faint, dried marks, but suspicion and confirmation were very different things. She paid for her stamps, exchanged a pleasantry about the weather, and left without adding fuel to Mrs. Price Ridley's fire. The frost had lifted into a pale, watery sunshine by the time she made her way toward the church. It was too early for the bell ringers, but she knew the verger would be about, tidying after the rehearsal. Mr. Lyle was, as expected, sweeping the porch with a certain dour energy, the kind of work that made a man feel useful without the risk of anyone telling him he'd done it wrong. "Good morning, Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was just passing and thought I'd ask after your grandson. Such a bright boy. I hope the excitement hasn't unsettled him." Mr. Lyle straightened, resting on his broom. "Peter?" "Oh, he's fine. Likes to be in the thick of things, that one. Though I've told him to keep away from the shed until the matter's settled. I'm sure that's wise. These little mysteries have a way of attracting the wrong sort of attention." He grunted, which in Mr. Lyle's vocabulary could mean anything from agreement to polite dismissal. Miss Marple took it as the former and continued, her tone conversational. "I couldn't help noticing yesterday that the lock on the shed is rather new. Was there some trouble with the old one?" "Broke last month," he said, shrugging. "Rust, I expect. Vicar had this one put on. Cost a bit more, but meant to last. Keys cut for me, him and the Institute secretary. That's all." Miss Marple tucked that away. The Institute secretary, she recalled, was Mrs. Denholm, a brisk, capable woman in her 40s who ran the committee as though it were a small but thriving firm. Mrs. Denholm had a tidy way of managing her own affairs, but had been known, in younger days, to keep company with the late Mr. Winfield's nephew, a connection which, though forgotten by most, was still filed in Miss Marple's mental index. She left Mr. Lyle to his sweeping and made her way home, but she did not sit idle. A little before noon, she took a different path, one that led past the Harringtons' house. It was a solid, respectable Georgian structure with white shutters and a garden that looked tidy even in winter. Mrs. Harrington herself was in the front, pruning a rose bush with more vigour than was strictly necessary. "Good morning," Miss Marple called, pausing at the gate. Mrs. Harrington looked up, her expression polite but cool. "Miss Marple, out enjoying the sun?" "Yes, though it's a pale one today. I was thinking of poor Clara. Such a trial for a young bride. I do hope the veil can be mended." Mrs. Harrington's pruning shears clicked sharply. "It can and it will. My sister's veil is too fine a piece to be ruined by childish nonsense. I've engaged Mrs. Ellison from Market Basing to do the work. She's a miracle with lace. How fortunate. I recall she once repaired an altar cloth that everyone said was beyond saving." A small nod acknowledged the compliment, but Mrs. Harrington's eyes were already back on the rose bush. "The important thing is to put this unpleasantness behind us. Michael and Clara deserve a happy wedding." Miss Marple agreed warmly, but she noted the faint tightness around Mrs. Harrington's mouth, as though the prospect of putting it behind them was less an act of forgiveness and more an act of will. On her way back through the high street, Miss Marple encountered Lydia Grant emerging from the milliner's, carrying a small box. Lydia was dressed in a manner calculated to be noticed, her cloche hat a deep green that flattered her eyes, yet her smile, when she saw Miss Marple, was a shade too bright. "Miss Marple, have you heard? They say it was a prank gone wrong." "Do they indeed?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "And who do they suppose was responsible?" "Oh, Someone from the bell ringers, of course, or perhaps young Alfie Carter. He's always up to mischief. Lydia's tone was airy, but her hands tightened slightly on the box. "I'm sure the truth will come out in time," Miss Marple said. "And how is your dress for the wedding? I imagine it will be quite the occasion." Lydia's eyes flickered. "Yes, I had to make some last-minute changes. Nothing serious, just alterations." They parted soon after, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Lydia's restless energy. Alterations could mean anything from a hem taken up to a dress remade entirely, and alterations, she knew, could also be made to the truth. That afternoon, a small but telling detail emerged. Mrs. Lyle, delivering eggs to the vicarage, let slip to the housemaid that she'd seen Michael Harrington speaking rather earnestly to Clara in the churchyard after the rehearsal. Earnestly, and with his hand gripping her arm. Clara had looked pale, almost tearful, and had drawn back when Mrs. Lyle approached. The housemaid, eager for a bit of currency, passed this on to the butcher's wife, who told it to Miss Cartwright, who mentioned it, quite innocently, when she stopped at Miss Marple's for tea. Miss Marple listened without comment, stirring her cup with an absent air. She thought of Clara's dread the previous day, of the gloves behind the hymn book, of the veil in the coal shed. Each piece was small and incomplete, but she had learned that the pattern often became clear only when one allowed the picture to form slowly, without forcing it. By evening, the village had settled into its Saturday routine. Men at the public house, women preparing Sunday roasts, children sent early to bed. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting, her thoughts turning over the events like pebbles in a tide. There was, she felt, a thread running through it all, something to do with possession, with what belonged to whom, and with the ways people marked territory in a place where land, objects, and even affections were as much a matter of inheritance as choice. She had just set her knitting aside when a knock came at the door. It was Peter, cap in hand, looking both nervous and proud. "Gran says I shouldn't bother you, but I thought you ought to see this," he said, producing from his pocket a small, folded square of paper. Miss Marple took it, her fingers steady, and unfolded it to reveal a scrap of ivory silk, its edge scalloped and embroidered with the same delicate pattern she had seen on the veil. The fabric was smudged with coal dust, and along one side was a faint brown streak. "Where did you find this, Peter?" "In the hedge behind the hall," he said. "This morning. I was looking for my ball." Miss Marple's eyes met his, and she smiled faintly. "Well, that was a very good find indeed, and quite by accident, I suppose." Peter nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Peter. And remember, best not to tell anyone else just yet. Sometimes a thing is more useful when it's not talked about." She closed the door behind him and held the scrap up to the lamplight. The stain was faint, but it was not coal nor port. She suspected she already knew what it was, and that knowledge brought with it a new question. If the veil had been placed in the shed for all to find, what had been removed from it first, and why? Miss Marple set the silk carefully in an envelope and placed it in her writing desk. Somewhere in the village someone was waiting for this matter to blow over, but she, with her patient habits and unassuming manner, would see to it that the next move was hers. The veil was not the only thing in Saint. Mary Mead that had been handled with gloves. The following day was Sunday, and St. Mary Mead moved at the unhurried pace of a village that still took the Sabbath seriously. The winter sun was pale but steady, casting long shadows across the churchyard as the congregation gathered in twos and threes, pausing for greetings that were as much for observation as for courtesy. Miss Marple, in her dove-grey coat and small felt hat, arrived early enough to find her usual pew, from which she could see not only the pulpit, but also the door and most of the aisles. Years of quiet attendance had taught her that people revealed themselves not only in what they said, but in how they entered a room, where they chose to sit and whose eyes they avoided. Clara Winfield came with her mother, both dressed with subdued elegance. Clara's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she seemed to shrink slightly as she passed through the line of parishioners already seated. Michael Harrington arrived separately with his mother. They took their place on the opposite side of the aisle, a distance that felt deliberate. Lydia Grant slipped in at the last possible moment. The brim of her hat angled low and took a place 2 pews behind the Winfields. The service itself was uneventful, but Miss Marple's attention was not on the hymns. She noticed how Clara did not turn once toward Michael, though she must have felt his gaze. How Mrs. Harrington sat very straight, her gloved hands folded as though braced for something. And how Lydia, during the final prayer, looked down at her lap with the faintest smile, as though enjoying a private thought. When the service ended, the congregation spilled into the cold air, the usual exchange of civilities overlaid with an undercurrent of curiosity. The veil had been the chief topic the day before, and though Mrs. Harrington had made it clear she considered the matter closed, few were ready to leave it there. Mrs. Price Ridley, for instance, could be overheard telling the grocer's wife that the repair work on the veil was mere cosmetics and that some stains never come out. Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the churchyard, exchanging pleasantries and making small observations. It was in this way she saw Dickie Pratt approach Clara, carefully, almost as though he were afraid of being seen, and say something in a low voice. Clara did not answer. She only shook her head, once, sharply, before turning to join her mother. Dickie stood a moment longer, then walked quickly away toward the lane that led past the old mill. By afternoon, Miss Marple had resolved to pay a visit to Mrs. Denholm, the Institute secretary, whose name Mr. Lyle had mentioned in connection with the shed key. The Institute was, after all, a hub of activity in the village, and its members often knew more than they realized they knew. Mrs. Denholm lived in a neat, semi-detached house on the far side of the green, with a front garden full of clipped shrubs and a small iron gate that squeaked when opened. She received Miss Marple warmly, offering tea and a slice of seed cake. The conversation began with the usual trifles, the success of the Christmas fete, the unfortunate state of the High Street cobbles, but Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, steered it toward the key to the shed. "Oh yes," Mrs. Denholm said, setting down her cup. "I've had it for years, ever since the Institute started using the hall for our meetings. Of course, I keep it in the top drawer of my writing desk. Perfectly safe. Anyone who wants to borrow it comes to me directly. Though I will say, last Thursday I lent it to Lydia Grant. She said she'd left her gloves in the hall after our meeting on Tuesday and wanted to fetch them before choir practice." Miss Marple kept her expression mild, though inwardly she felt a small piece of the puzzle click into place. "And did she return it to you directly?" "She did, later that evening. I was out when she came, but she slipped it through the letterbox in an envelope. I found it on the mat the next morning." Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the matter rest there for now. She knew from experience that pressing too quickly could close a door as surely as slamming it. After a few more pleasantries, she took her leave, the squeak of the gate sounding unusually loud in the still afternoon. As she walked home, she thought of Lydia's sudden appearance at the church rehearsal, her red-rimmed eyes, her claim of last-minute dress alterations, and the curious fact of the gloves behind the hymn book. It was possible, of course, that she had indeed left her gloves in the hall after a meeting. But why not fetch them sooner? And why choose the very evening when the choir and Clara would be present? Late that afternoon, the weather turned, bringing a fine mist that clung to the hedges and blurred the outlines of the cottages. Miss Marple, looking out from her sitting room, saw Michael Harrington pass along the lane, his head bent against the damp. A few moments later, Lydia appeared from the opposite direction, moving quickly and glancing over her shoulder once before disappearing round the corner. There was no sign they had met, but the timing was close enough to make her wonder. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple took the scrap of silk from her writing desk and examined it again. It seemed to her that the tear along the edge was too clean for an accident. A snag on a nail or a rough edge of coal would have left an irregular fray, but this was precise, as if cut by something sharp and deliberate. She wondered whether the main veil bore a corresponding mark, or whether this piece had been removed for some purpose of its own. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Winfield arrived at Miss Marple's door, looking more troubled than she had allowed herself to seem in public. She declined tea and sat forward in her chair, hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," she began, "I'm afraid I must speak plainly. There is something not right about this business with the veil. Clara is distressed, more than a young bride ought to be. She swears she has no idea how it came to be in the shed. But I think she's afraid of someone." Miss Marple listened quietly, allowing the pause to stretch until Mrs. Winfield continued. "She hasn't said as much, but I suspect she and Michael quarrelled after the rehearsal. He's been distant these past days. And then there's Lydia. I've seen the way she looks at him. I'm not suggesting anything improper, but—" She broke off, as if realizing she had said more than she intended. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "when people mean to cause no harm, their actions can still set things in motion. And in a village, those motions can carry farther than they expect." Mrs. Winfield gave a small, weary smile. "You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I only hope we can get through the wedding without more trouble." When she had gone, Miss Marple sat a while in thought. Clara's fear, Michael's distance, Lydia's presence in the hall with the key, and the gloves hidden in the pew, all pointed to a tangle of feelings not easily smoothed. And then there was the matter of the stain on the veil and the scrap of silk in the hedge, each suggesting something that had happened before the veil was ever placed in the coal shed. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky of washed-out blue. Miss Marple took her usual walk toward the green, her eyes noting small things, the way Mrs. Cartwright's curtains twitched as she passed, the sound of a hammer from the blacksmith's shop, the faint scent of wood smoke from a chimney. Outside the tea shop, she caught sight of Dickie Pratt again, this time talking to young Alfie Carter. When they saw her, the conversation stopped abruptly, and Alfie muttered something before walking off. Dickie, left standing alone, gave her an awkward smile. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Dickie. I do hope you're keeping out of mischief." He laughed, a little too quickly. "Always, miss. Always." But his eyes darted toward the church as he spoke. She let him go without pressing him, but she made a note to keep an eye on him. Boys with guilty consciences often gave themselves away, not in what they did, but in what they avoided. That night, as the village settled into quiet, Miss Marple sat by her fire and let the pieces arrange themselves in her mind. The veil, the gloves, the scrap of silk, the borrowed key, the glances and distances between certain people. It was all part of a pattern she could almost see, but not yet clearly enough. There was still some small, essential detail missing, and she knew from long experience that such details often revealed themselves not through confrontation, but through patient watching. For now, she would wait. The wedding was only days away, and in that brief span she suspected, whatever had been set in motion would have to run its course. And when it did, she would be ready to see the truth in the moment it showed its face. By Monday, the village had adopted the calm of people determined to go on as usual, which in St. Mary Mead meant that the appearance of calm was part of the usual. Miss Marple, who liked her routines to be useful as well as comforting, wrote a note to Mrs. Ellison in Market Basing, and took the early bus. It was the sort of errand no one would question. Ladies often popped over for lace, needles, or the particular cotton one could never find when one needed it. Mrs. Ellison kept a neat, bright workroom above a wool shop, where light from the tall window fell kindly on the fabrics and cruelly on any imperfection. She was a pleasant, practical woman, with the swift, fine hands of a person who mends not only cloth, but the pride of those who wear it. At the sight of Miss Marple, she exclaimed over the cold and produced tea from a cupboard that had seen more confidences than any drawing room. "I'm told you have taken on a very delicate task," Miss Marple said, letting admiration warm her tone. "The Harrington veil. Such treasures make me nervous even to look at." Mrs. Ellison's mouth softened. "It is a fine thing, and no mistake. French lace older than any of us have a right to touch. But it will do." She lowered her voice without seeming to. "It would have done better without the handling. It's had." "You mean the tear," Miss Marple said, mild as milk. "The tear and the markings. Settled, you know. Not yesterday's mischief." She hesitated. Then, guided by the safe, listening face across from her, went on. "A bride's veil sees tears, and sometimes a nosebleed if a girl is excited. This isn't that. It's where a hand has pressed, and something on that hand left its memory. Not grease, not wine. Old and iron-leaning." Miss Marple made a small, regretful sound. "What a pity." "Not beyond mending," Mrs. Ellison said, brisk again. "I'll take a scallop out here and mirror the border. Fortunately, a length of the edging was, how shall I put it, available." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow a fraction. "Available?" "A scrap turned up with the packet." Mrs. Ellison's expression admitted disapproval. "It had clearly been cut, not torn. Neatly, too. I suppose someone thought it would help me match the pattern." She reached aside and, without fuss, showed the slender piece. Scalloped edge, coal-dusted ghost, the same fine threadwork. It was a twin to the triangle Miss Marple had placed in her desk. "How clever of them," Miss Marple murmured, which was her way of marking folly. "And how lucky for Clara." At the name, Mrs. Ellison's needle paused. "The girl is pale, poor thing. Came with Mrs. Harrington yesterday to see that I had it in hand. Said hardly a word. Mrs. Harrington said them all." "Mrs. Harrington is a tower," Miss Marple agreed. "And towers sometimes cast a shadow at the wrong time of day." She stood, praising the deftness of the work, and took her leave as gently as she had arrived. On the bus back, she turned over the word "available." The scrap in her desk had not come with the packet, for she had it. There were two scraps then, or one person who wanted very much to be helpful to the repair, and another who wanted to be helpful to her. She thought of Peter's solemn face, the hedge behind the hall, the faint brown line that was not coal. She also thought of the clean cut along the veil, and the way some people, when they mean to stage an accident, make it too tidy. At the vicarage, she inquired after the church flowers, only to see if my blue glass vases wouldn't do better with the lilies, dear, and found the housemaid in a mood to chat. There had been unusual comings and goings, she reported. Mrs. Harrington twice to speak with the vicar. Ever so polite, but you do feel as if your apron isn't clean enough. And Lydia Grant to ask about the choir rota, though she wasn't in the choir any longer. "Not in the choir?" Miss Marple echoed, surprised into plainness. "Oh, not for a bit. She left after harvest. Something about late practices not suiting, but she's been about this week like." The girl wiped the table with vigour. "And there was a gentleman telephoned on Sunday morning asking when the church would be empty." "For a quiet pray," he said. "Did he give a name?" "No, miss, but he sounded as if he didn't want one." The girl grinned. "Men don't. when they want to be quiet. Outside, the path to the coal shed was darkened with damp, and the lock shone in that particular way new things do when their surroundings are old. Miss Marple stood a moment, hearing in her head the squeak Peter had described, and, underneath it, the low thrum of village life, committees, keys, the passing back and forth of small authorities. Near the gate she came upon Dickie Pratt, hands thrust in his pockets, cap low. He greeted her with the mixture of bravado and respect boys reserve for people who have known them since muddy knees. "Lot of traffic for a Monday, miss." "Churches bring it on themselves," she said. "They are so useful. Tell me, Dickie, when you ring on Thursdays, do you keep to time?" He looked offended. "We do. Mr. Barnes, he's stout. He keeps us." "Why?" "Oh, only because I wonder who enjoys wandering the yard after dark. Some men like the air, some like a pipe, and some like company." She let the last word sit like a crumb on a saucer. Dickie's eyes flickered. "If you mean Alfie, he's the one about. Talks more than he rings." "Alfie has a talent for being where tales are told," Miss Marple agreed. "And for improving them. Did he improve any Thursday?" "I didn't say that." His jaw set. People say I looked in on the hall. I never. I went straight off. Ask Mr. Barnes. Ask him." "I will," she said, so mildly it disarmed him. "You have the hands for truth, Dickie. They fidget when you lie." She left him affronted but grateful, which was not an unpleasant combination in a boy. At home, the afternoon brought rain pricking at the panes and Mrs. Winfield with a parcel. "Clara's trousseau things," she explained, with an attempt at gaiety that felt like a paper fan against a gale. "I cannot keep them in the house at present. Every time she sees lace, Well, would you keep them a day or two, Miss Marple? You are so good." Miss Marple took the parcel and the confidence both. "Of course. How is she?" "Quiet. Too quiet." Mrs. Winfield hesitated. "She had a note. Slipped under the door in the night. I shouldn't show you. It's wicked to spread these things, but I am at my wit's end." She drew from her reticule a card, cheap and stiff, with 4 words printed by hand in a firm, unremarkable script. "Do not wear stolen vows." Miss Marple read, and for the first time in days allowed herself to feel anger, not the hot kind that shouts, but the cold kind that arranges. "When?" "Sometime between 11 and morning. I was up at 1:30. The house was still." "Has anyone else seen this?" "Only Michael. He said it was nonsense, but he was white, Miss Marple." "May I keep it a little while?" Miss Marple asked. And when Mrs. Winfield nodded, she wrapped the nasty bit of paper in a clean sheet, as if she were bandaging a small wound. After Mrs. Winfield left, Miss Marple unfolded the trousseau parcel as if it were a map. Among the chemises and handkerchiefs lay a length of narrow ribbon, white once, now dulled with much touching. It had been embroidered long ago with tiny orange blossoms, the old symbol of bridal hope. She knew at once what it was, the tie that had once fastened the veil's little coronet to a bride's hair. It had come along with the veil through the years, forgotten and remembered in turns. Along one edge, near the tails, was a faint ridge where a stitch had been, unpicked with care. Something had been attached there, once, and removed. Her fingers, light as thoughts, followed the ridge and found the smallest remnant of thread of a different colour altogether, a warmer, almost honey shade. A repair, or the memory of an adornment. She was still considering it when Michael Harrington himself arrived, hat in hand, rein on the shoulders of his overcoat. He looked as if sleep had been trimming him by degrees. "I shouldn't have come," he said before she could rise. "Mother would say so, but Clara is not herself, and I cannot find out why without making it worse." Miss Marple indicated the chair near the fire. "Young men never come when they should and always when they must. Sit, Mr. Harrington. You will drip on my rug if you stand." He smiled despite himself, and sat like a man expecting judgment. You know about the veil, of course, and about the message. It's nonsense, vicious nonsense, but it has done what it meant to do. Hurt, Miss Marple said. Hurt, he echoed. His hands, large and sun-browned from work on the farms he was supposed merely to oversee, flexed on his knee. There is also Lydia. People will talk. We were friends. I helped her once or twice after her father died. Money. It was nothing one need whisper about. But I see now how it looks. He lifted his eyes to Miss Marple's, as if to ask whether truth mattered when eyes were busy with appearances. Truth always matters, she said. But it seldom speaks first. Did you meet her on Sunday? No. The denial came quickly, then softened. She wrote me on Saturday, late, a note asking to see me. I did not go. Why not? Because Clara had had enough to bear that day. He stopped, then added, with a grim honesty that improved him, and because I was afraid of what Lydia might say, not about me, about Clara. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. What could Lydia say about Clara that would carry weight? He looked down. Once, before Clara and I were engaged, Lydia told me something. Told me Clara had been seen walking with a man from the garage very late. It was nonsense. Clara had been with her mother, but Lydia... He spread his hands. She says things. They sound true until you hold them, up to the light. Some people, Miss Marple said, are skilled in embroidery. They add without seeming to. She let him sit with that. What do you fear now? That Lydia has some hook. I paid her rent once, quietly. If she tells it as a story of obligation, or worse, it will spoil the week for Clara. She thinks people's minds are like her own. Clean. Clean minds wash easily, Miss Marple said. Dirty ones do not. Tell your mother nothing. Tell Clara everything. Secrets make shadows longer. When he had gone, she sat very still. The card on her table, the scrap of silk in her desk, the twin scrap at Mrs. Ellison's, the coronet ribbon with its missing something, the borrowed key, Lydia's return to places she no longer had a right to be. Each had weight enough to tip a scale if placed together. Yet there was one more small test to make. Toward evening, she sent Peter with a basket of scones to the Institute rooms. From me to Mrs. Denholm, with my thanks for the jam labels, and asked, as one asks a boy to fetch a thimble, whether the key on the hook by the vestry still had the little nick near the bow. You know, the one that makes it catch a bit. Peter returned, cheeks bright with errand importance. That key's been changed, miss. New one, shiny and smooth. Has it indeed? She buttered a scone for him as if that were all the answer required. When he had gone, she allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. Someone had not only used the Institute's key, someone had seen to it that traces of the using would not be noticed by those who did not count keys for a hobby. That night, the rain eased. In the hush that follows weather, St. Mary Mead listened to its own breathing. Close on 11, a figure moved along the hedge by the church, swift and sure. A gloved hand reached to the porch, where notices of fêtes and harvest suppers were posted, and pinned there a white ribbon, tied in a tight, neat knot. In the morning it would be seen first by anyone who came early to polish the brass or count the hymn books. It would look innocent to most, perhaps even charming, a message of hope to a bride. But Miss Marple, waking before dawn as old people sometimes do, felt something tautened in the air, like a string drawn back. Knots meant ownership. Knots remembered what hands had done them. She rose, put on her shawl, and looked out into the paling dark. Somewhere in the village, someone who dealt in little arrangements had made another. Very soon, she thought, it would be time to pluck at the knot and see whose fingers trembled when it came loose. The white ribbon was still there when Miss Marple reached the church the next morning, its bow so precise it might have been tied by a milliner. The mist softened it to a ghostly shape against the dark wood of the porch, and from a distance it could almost have been mistaken for an ornament for the wedding to come. But up close, she could see how the knot had been pulled taut. Not a careless tying, but the deliberate kind that would leave a crease in the fabric for days. She touched it lightly, noting the faint scent of something sharp and sweet, like lavender polish, before unpinning it. Mr. Lyle was already at work in the vestry, polishing the brass eagle lectern. He glanced up as she entered, the ribbon draped over her hand. Left by some well-wisher, no doubt, he said with the air of a man trying to tidy away an untidy thought. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied mildly, slipping the ribbon into her reticule. Though it is curious how many tokens arrive in the night when no one is there to receive them. She made no mention of the change of key, or of Peter's errand. Some facts were better kept under one's hat until they had ripened. The rehearsal for the wedding was set for that afternoon, and by the time Miss Marple arrived, the air in the church was thick with the sound of shuffling feet and polite instructions. Clara was there in a simple pale coat, her hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat, but her expression had the fixed brightness of someone performing cheerfulness for an audience. Michael was attentive but careful, his hand never lingering too long on hers. Mrs. Harrington directed proceedings from the second pew, correcting the vicar when he misremembered the order of the recessional, while Mrs. Winfield sat quietly, her eyes seldom leaving her daughter. Lydia arrived late, as before, though this time she took a place much nearer the front, ostensibly to help with the positioning of the bridesmaids. Her dress was a deep blue that caught the light, and she had pinned a small brooch at her collar, a silver knot, delicate and exact. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it just long enough to note the familiarity of its loops. During a pause in the rehearsal, Lydia bent to speak to Clara, her voice low, but her smile almost affectionate. Clara nodded once, quickly, and turned away. Michael, watching from a few steps behind, stiffened, though he said nothing. Miss Marple, who had seen many conversations carried out under the guise of civility, thought she detected the brief tightening of Clara's hand against her coat pocket, as though she were holding something there. When the rehearsal ended, people drifted out into the cold air in small knots of conversation. Miss Marple lingered near the porch, watching as Lydia stepped out alone, pausing to adjust her glove before walking toward the lane. A moment later, Michael appeared, striding past her without so much as a glance, his jaw set. The space between them was almost more telling than any words might have been. Miss Marple walked home slowly, turning over the ribbon in her mind. Its deliberate knot, Lydia's brooch, the message slipped under the Winfields' door. They were all of a piece, the work of someone who understood that symbols could sting as sharply as words. That evening, as the shadows drew long, there was another knock at her door. This time, it was Lydia herself, smiling with an ease that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought I might trouble you for a moment, Miss Marple," she said, stepping lightly into the parlour without waiting for a full invitation. "It's about the wedding. You've such an eye for what's proper. I wondered, do you think Clara ought to carry her veil into the church, or have it waiting for her there?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I suppose it depends on whether she means to wear it as she walks in. It can be very striking, you know, for the veil to come down only at the altar." Lydia laughed softly, her gaze drifting around the room. "Yes, striking. But of course one must have a veil in good order for that." "It is being repaired, I hear." "Yes. Mrs. Ellison does wonders. Still, some things are never quite the same, are they?" Lydia's voice was light, but there was a flicker of something sharp beneath it. She looked back at Miss Marple. "You've probably heard all sorts of rumours. People do like to invent stories when they're bored." "Stories often begin with a truth," Miss Marple said quietly. "A very small truth, sometimes. like a thread, waiting to be pulled. For a moment, Lydia's eyes narrowed, but she recovered quickly, offering a bright farewell and leaving as suddenly as she had come. Miss Marple watched her go, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air after her departure. Later that night, Miss Marple examined the ribbon again under her lamp. The scent was the same as Lydia's. She traced the knot with her fingers, noting how the loops had been twisted in such a way that the ends lay hidden, a flourish more decorative than functional. It was a signature of sorts, small, neat, and meant to be recognized by the right eyes. The following morning brought a change in the weather, and with it, the sort of news that moved quickly through the village. Alfie Carter had been caught in the yard behind the church just after dawn, supposedly looking for a lost pocket knife. Mr. Lyle had found him near the coal shed and sent him off with a sharp word. By breakfast, the tale had grown into an accusation that Alfie had been tampering with the shed lock. By the time Miss Marple heard it, some were suggesting he had been the one to put the veil there in the first place. Miss Marple found Alfie that afternoon, leaning against the wall outside the smithy. He greeted her with a sheepish grin. "They've all got me as the villain now, miss." "It's easy to be a villain in other people's stories," she said, "especially if one is already fond of shortcuts." "I didn't touch the veil," he said quickly. "Didn't even see it till it was all over the place. And this morning, I was just cutting through. Dropped my knife there yesterday. Ask Dickie." Miss Marple did not need to. She could see in the angle of his shoulders that he was telling the truth, or at least the part of it that mattered. If Alfie had been used as a scapegoat, then someone had made sure to place him where suspicion would be ready to meet him. The day before the wedding, the repaired veil returned to the Winfields' house. Mrs. Ellison's work was as fine as promised, the tear invisible, the lace smooth and clean. But Miss Marple noticed at once what Mrs. Winfield had not. The edging was subtly different on one side. The scallop mirrored so neatly, it would only be obvious to someone who had studied the pattern closely. And in place of the coronet's original ribbon was a new one, white and fresh. Its knot simple and without flourish. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short note and sent it by Peter to Michael Harrington, requesting that he and Clara call on her early the next morning on a matter that may bear on the peace of their wedding day. She did not explain further, but she was certain they would come. When they arrived, Clara's face was drawn, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes, as though she had been waiting for someone else to name the shadow that had been following her. Michael looked tired, but resolute. Miss Marple poured tea, let them settle, and then placed the ribbon from the church porch on the table beside the coronet's new tie. "Some people," she said gently, "have a way of leaving their mark. A certain knot, a certain scent. It is a small vanity, but one that makes them known to those who pay attention." Clara stared at the ribbon, then at Michael, and her hands tightened in her lap. "I didn't tell you," she said in a low voice, "because I thought it would pass. But she's been leaving things for weeks. Notes, ribbons, once a pair of gloves on my window ledge. Always with that smell. I thought if I ignored them, they would stop," Miss Marple finished for her. "But such gestures are not meant to be ignored. They are meant to unsettle, to make you think that what is yours might be stolen, or that it never was yours at all." Michael's jaw clenched. "Lydia," Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "She had opportunity, the key from Mrs. Denholm, and a motive, though perhaps not the one most would imagine. Not love, I think, but possession. Of a story, of a place in it, and of the satisfaction of having her hand on the thread that could pull it all apart." Clara's eyes filled, but her voice was steady. "Then she won't have it. Not tomorrow." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite right. And perhaps, once the knot is unpicked, it will no longer hold." She saw them to the door, the ribbon still on the table, its scent faint but persistent. The morning was bright and cold, the air carrying the promise of frost. Somewhere in the village, Lydia would be preparing to watch the wedding she had tried to shadow. And Miss Marple, who knew the value of letting certain performances play to the end, was already considering how best to choose her moment. There was more yet to be revealed, and she intended to see it done in the full light of day. The morning of the wedding broke bright and cold, the sort of air that made breath show like little puffs of smoke. St. Mary Mead was awake early, as though the village itself meant to be dressed and ready in time. Curtains twitched, and the postman's whistle seemed cheerier than usual. The church bell, silent for now, waited like an actor in the wings. Miss Marple was ready well before she needed to be. She had chosen a dark blue coat and a small felt hat, trimmed with a feather. Nothing to draw attention, but neat enough for the occasion. Before leaving, she slipped the white ribbon into her reticule, along with the cheap card that had carried its nastier message days before. The scrap of veil remained in her desk, safely out of the way. The Winfields' house was already a hive of activity when she passed. Mrs. Winfield stood at the upstairs window, adjusting the curtain, her face pale but composed. Clara, she knew, would be surrounded by women, pinned and fastened into her dress, spoken to in soothing tones that made her feel more like a porcelain figure than a living girl. Across the green, Mrs. Harrington's front door opened to admit a florid man in a dark coat, the organist from Market Basing, while Michael's best man stood on the step, rubbing his hands against the cold. By 10:30, the church was filling. The pews creaked as people settled, each with a good view of the aisle if they could manage it. Mrs. Price Ridley, in a hat that looked like it might take flight, was already whispering to Mrs. Cartwright about the scandal of Lydia's dress. Emerald green, a shade too bold for a wedding guest. Miss Marple took her seat midway down on the left, where she could see the nave and the porch door without turning her head. When Lydia arrived, it was in a swirl of perfume and colour, her hat a clever little tilt of black felt that set off the green of her dress. At her collar was the silver knot brooch, polished to a bright gleam. She took her place 2 pews ahead, her head inclined slightly toward the aisle, as though she meant to enjoy every moment of the spectacle. Her hands were gloved in pale grey, the sort that would leave no smudge on lace. The organ began softly, the congregation shifting in their seats as the murmuring faded. Michael came first, walking with a steadiness that Miss Marple recognised as deliberate. His eyes were fixed on the altar, his jaw tight. The bridesmaids followed, Lydia watching them with that faint, private smile Miss Marple had seen before. And then Clara, her veil in place, the repaired lace falling softly over her face, the coronet tied with the new simple ribbon. She moved slowly, her gaze fixed ahead, and if her hands trembled, the small bouquet of winter roses hid it well. The service began without incident, the words flowing as they had at the rehearsal. It was only after the vows were spoken and the couple turned to face the congregation that Miss Marple noticed Lydia move. It was the smallest shift, a lean forward, as though ready to speak or perhaps to stand. Her hand lifted slightly to her brooch, her fingers brushing the knot in a way that seemed more habit than adjustment. And in that moment, Miss Marple understood, not the petty malice alone, but the satisfaction of having planted a seed and watching it grow. When the organ swelled and the party began the recessional, Miss Marple slipped from her pew and moved quietly toward the side aisle, arriving at the porch just as Clara and Michael emerged into the pale winter sunlight. There were the usual cheers, the flutter of confetti, the vicar smiling benignly at the happy pair. Miss Marple waited until Lydia stepped forward, offering her congratulations in a voice sweet enough to coat the air. "My dear, Lydia said, her gloved hand resting for a moment on Clara's arm. You do look exquisite, and that veil, so fortunate it could be saved. Clara's smile was thin, but she said nothing. Michael was already guiding her toward the waiting carriage. Miss Marple stepped forward then, her manner pleasant but firm. Miss Grant, may I borrow you for just a moment? There's a small matter I'd like to clear up before the reception. Lydia blinked, the smile freezing in place. Now? Surely it can wait. It will take only a moment, Miss Marple said, and there was something in her tone that left no room for refusal. They stepped a little aside, out of the crush of people. Miss Marple reached into her reticule and drew out the ribbon from the church porch, holding it delicately by one end. I found this tied to the church notice board 2 mornings ago. Curious, isn't it? Such a precise knot, very like the one on your brooch. Lydia's eyes flicked to the ribbon and back again. I've no idea what you mean. Ribbons are hardly unusual at weddings. True, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. And yet this one was not there the evening before. It was placed in the dark, by someone who had no wish to be seen. And it bears the faintest scent of lavender polish, the same scent you left in my parlour when you called. For a heartbeat, Lydia said nothing. Then she gave a small, dismissive laugh. If you're suggesting I crept about tying ribbons in the night, I'm afraid I can't oblige you with a confession. Miss Marple regarded her gently. Not a confession, only an understanding. You see, this is not about a ribbon or a veil. It's about wanting to be the one who holds the thread, to pull it when you choose, to make others dance to the movement. But threads can be cut, Miss Grant, quietly, cleanly. And once they are, there is nothing left to hold. Lydia's smile faltered. You think you've cut it. I think, Miss Marple said, that today it has slipped from your fingers, and you will find that people are less inclined to look where you want them to look. A voice called Lydia's name from the steps, and she turned away without another word, her posture still graceful, but her expression tight. Miss Marple watched her go, the silver knot glinting in the pale light, and wondered how long it would be before Lydia found another thread to play with. At the reception in the Harringtons' garden, the air was warmer with the press of people and the scent of food. Clara and Michael moved among their guests with the unsteady grace of newlyweds, accepting congratulations and the occasional curious glance. Mrs. Harrington presided with the air of a general who has brought her regiment through a skirmish, while Mrs. Winfield kept close to her daughter, her relief only partly hidden. Miss Marple stayed for a modest slice of cake and a glass of sherry, chatting with the vicar and Mrs. Denholm about the success of the day. She noticed that Lydia kept to the edges of the crowd, speaking in brief bursts and never lingering long in one place. There were still eyes on her, but they were curious now, rather than admiring. The story, Miss Marple knew, was already shifting. As the light faded and the first guests began to leave, Miss Marple took her leave as well, walking home through the quiet lanes. The frost was beginning to form again, catching the last of the sun on the hedges. In her sitting room she set the ribbon and the card in a small envelope and tucked it into a drawer. Some things, she thought, were worth keeping, not as trophies, but as reminders. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the village settle into evening. Somewhere beyond the green, the newlyweds would be sharing their first hours together as man and wife. And somewhere else, Lydia Grant would be thinking of the moment she had been stopped, and perhaps, if Miss Marple was right, already plotting another game. But for now, the veil was safe, the wedding unmarred, and the thread, at least this one, had been cut. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the corners of her mouth lifting in a small, private smile. Human nature, she knew, was as constant as the turning of the seasons, and just as predictable in its patterns. The trick was in seeing them early, and knowing when to tie and when to untie the knot. The days after the wedding settled into a kind of polite quiet, as though the village had collectively decided that any further talk might be unseemly. But Miss Marple, who knew the rhythms of gossip as some know the tides, understood that this was only the pause before it turned its attention to the next available subject. Lydia Grant, she noticed, had retreated somewhat from her usual rounds. She was seen less often at the tea shop, and when she did appear, it was with a briskness that discouraged lingering. People remarked, with the careful vagueness of the English, that perhaps she had a great deal to occupy her. Miss Marple, however, felt no satisfaction in Lydia's withdrawal. She had seen enough of human nature to know that people like Lydia did not simply vanish from the stage. They stepped into the wings, waiting for another cue. And there was still something about the business of the veil that refused to sit neatly in its box. The matter of the 2 scraps of lace, hers and Mrs. Ellison's, was a pebble in her shoe, small but impossible to ignore. On the Tuesday following the wedding, she took the bus again to Market Basing. Mrs. Ellison greeted her warmly, assuming she had come to praise the work once more. But Miss Marple, after the customary politeness, steered the conversation to the scrap of lace she had been given for matching the repair. "Oh, that," Mrs. Ellison said, pulling open a drawer in her work table. "Still here. Too fine to throw away. Why?" "I wondered," Miss Marple said, examining it closely, "whether you might have been sent more than one piece." Mrs. Ellison looked puzzled. "Only this, with the veil. Came wrapped in tissue inside the same box. The tier was too high to take from the hem directly, so I assumed someone had thought ahead and cut this for me." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Indeed. How thoughtful. And did you know who brought the veil to you?" Mrs. Ellison shook her head. "A boy from the errand service. Said it was from the Harringtons, though whether from the mother or the bride, he couldn't say." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind turning over the implications. If Mrs. Ellison's scrap had been cut before the veil arrived in Market Basing, then the one Peter found could not be the same, which meant that someone had removed a second piece at a different time, likely before the veil had ever been placed in the coal shed. But for what purpose? Back in St. Mary Mead, she decided to pay a call on Peter Lyle. She found him in the yard behind the vicarage, polishing a bicycle with the earnestness of someone who knows it will not stay clean for long. "Peter," she said pleasantly, "do you remember exactly how you found that piece of lace?" He nodded vigorously. "It was caught in the hedge behind the hall, near the corner where the gate sticks. I was looking for my ball. It wasn't deep in, just snagged on the outside." "On the outside," Miss Marple repeated as though to fix it in her mind. "And no one else about?" "Not then. But I'd seen Miss Grant walk that way the night before, when the bell ringers were coming out. This was said without malice. Peter had the straightforward way of boys who tell what they've seen, without yet realising the uses it can be put to." Miss Marple thanked him and left him to his bicycle. That evening, she took the scrap from her desk and compared it to the one she had examined at Mrs. Ellison's. They were almost identical in size, though hers had the faint brown streak and the smell of coal dust, while Mrs. Ellison's was cleaner, as though cut in a more deliberate, less hurried fashion. Both had been taken from the scalloped border, but from different places. She could think of only one reason to take 2 separate pieces, one to aid the repair, and another to serve as a token. Tokens, she knew, could be trophies, or reminders, or even weapons in the right hands. And in the hands of someone like Lydia Grant, they could be all 3. The next day brought her an unexpected visitor, Michael Harrington, alone and looking troubled. He declined tea, which was unusual for a man raised to accept it automatically. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for what you did before the wedding. Clara. Well, she knows. She knows you stopped it from going further. But there's something else. Miss Marple waited. On our first night back here, Clara found something in the pocket of her coat. She hadn't worn it since the rehearsal. It was a tiny bit of lace, looked like it had been cut from her veil. She didn't tell me at first because she thought it was just something that had come loose before the repair. But after what you said about the ribbon... He broke off, shaking his head. We burned it. I didn't want her keeping it. Was it clean? Miss Marple asked. Yes. No dust, no stain, but the edge, sharp, like scissors. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time, the fire burning low beside her. That made 3 scraps now. Mrs. Ellison's, Peter's, and the one Clara had found. And all from the same veil. Whoever had taken them had not done so all at once. They had been cut at different times, in different circumstances. Which meant that Lydia, or whoever else might have handled the veil, had revisited it more than once. The pattern was beginning to show itself. The veil had been more than a wedding ornament. It had been turned into a stage, a place where certain symbols could be placed and seen by exactly the right people. Each scrap was a message. One had been used to assist the repair, the respectable explanation. Another had been hidden in the hedge, waiting to be found and linked to the coal shed. And the last, left in Clara's coat, had been the quietest and most cruel of all, meant to tell her that even in her most private moments, someone could reach her. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to leave such threads untied. She took her hat and coat and walked to the Institute, where Mrs. Denholm was overseeing the rearrangement of chairs after a meeting. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "you remember lending the key to Miss Grant that Thursday?" "Of course," Mrs. Denholm replied. "Why?" "I wondered if you might know whether she returned it herself, or whether it was the same key you lent her." Mrs. Denholm frowned. "Well, as I told you before, she posted it through my letterbox in an envelope. I didn't think to check. Why should I? But now that you mention it, when I put it back on the hook in my desk, it did look rather newer than before." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "Sometimes, you see, a new key is not to open something, but to hide that the old one has been used." By the time she returned home, she had the shape of the thing in her mind. Lydia had used the Institute key to reach the coal shed and the veil. She had cut one piece to make the damage appear practical, one to plant in the hedge for discovery, and one to place in Clara's coat as a private blow. The ribbon and the card had been the public gestures, meant for the whole village to see and speculate over. Together they formed a pattern of petty malice designed to weaken Clara before her wedding day. But Miss Marple also knew that patterns were only useful if they could be shown to those who needed to see them. And she doubted very much that Lydia would confess to such a scheme out of guilt. That would require a nudge, a setting in which she might be tempted to claim her cleverness without realizing she was being overheard. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. On Thursday afternoon, she found Lydia at the tea shop, seated with Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell, both of whom were eager for any morsel of novelty. Miss Marple, ordering her own tea, allowed herself to be coaxed to their table. They spoke of the wedding, how lovely Clara had looked, how dignified Michael had been. Lydia listened with a faint smile, saying little until Miss Hartnell remarked that the repaired veil was almost as good as new. "Almost," Lydia said, the corner of her mouth curling. Of course, one never quite forgets when something has been tampered with. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Tampered with? Such a strong word, my dear, almost as though someone meant to leave a sign. Lydia's eyes glinted. Well, if they did, it was certainly done with a light touch. Enough to make one think, perhaps, but not enough to spoil the whole thing. Mrs. Price Ridley chuckled, but Miss Marple only smiled, the way one does at a child caught boasting. Yes, a very light touch indeed. One might almost mistake it for the knot of a ribbon, or the trimming of lace. For just a moment, Lydia's expression shifted. Pride, unguarded and almost eager. Then she caught herself, leaning back with a laugh. You do have a way of making the smallest things sound important, Miss Marple. Miss Marple sipped her tea without replying. The smallest things she knew were often the ones that mattered most. And now she had what she needed. Not a confession for the police, for there was no crime here worth their time, but enough for those whose opinion mattered. Enough to make Lydia's quiet withdrawal from the centre of village life less of a mystery and more of a certainty. As she walked home through the crisp air, she thought of Clara, now past the strain of those weeks, and of Michael, who would likely never know the full measure of what had been done. And she thought of Lydia, retreating not in defeat, but in search of another stage. The pattern, she knew, would repeat itself somewhere, sometime. But here, for now, the thread was cut, the knot undone, and the veil, like the village, was whole again. It was not in Miss Marple's habit to congratulate herself, and so, after her tidy success with ribbons and scraps and the cutting of one troublesome thread, she did what she always did after a village storm. She set about her ordinary tasks and listened. Ordinary tasks, properly undertaken, have a way of drawing out what grander efforts miss. While she sorted her mending basket that Wednesday, buttons in one saucer, hooks and eyes in another, it occurred to her that one saucer in St. Mary Mead had not yet been properly examined, the saucer that held the veil's past. The notion did not arrive with a fanfare. It came in quietly, on a memory of the coronet ribbon she had found among Clara's trousseau, the faint ridge of old stitches, the single hair of honey-coloured thread. People keep thread the way they keep authority, in the shade that suits them. Mrs. Harrington, Miss Marple recalled, carried a small travelling work case to every committee meeting. It was shaped like a flattened pear and contained very nice things indeed: mother-of-pearl buttons, a silver thimble, and, if one looked down politely when it was opened to produce a length of cotton for an emergency, one might notice that her favourite shade for repairs was a warm, pale gold. Practical, she called it. It disappeared on linen. There was, too, the phrase on the cheap card, "Do not wear stolen vows," which had stuck under Miss Marple's skin precisely because it was nastier than Lydia's little elegancies. Lydia liked to tease and to show off. She left scent and knots. The card had no scent. It had the clean, firm hand of a woman who wrote minutes and expected them to be followed. And if there was one thing Mrs. Harrington disliked, it was a thing done in the wrong way by the wrong person. Miss Marple did not decide, therefore, to accuse anyone. She decided to pay a call. She chose a pretext as innocent as rain. A borrowed hymn book, which she had in fact borrowed months ago, and repaired herself when its stitching loosened. She tucked it into a bag with her knitting and set out across the green. Mrs. Harrington received her in the morning room, which, like all rooms under her command, contrived to look both comfortable and inspected. The fire was just right. The roses, winter roses from the hot house, were arranged so that none of them had to fight for light. "How kind," Mrs. Harrington said when the hymn book appeared. "We were just remarking at the last practice that number 326 had vanished." "I freshened the binding," Miss Marple said. "It had been pulled too tightly and cut itself. Things do if one makes them too smart. They need a little give." She smiled, and in the small quiet that followed, she allowed herself the tiniest glance at the needlework basket on the side table. A pear-shaped case, open, a reel of cotton the colour of pale honey, scissors with neat, cruel points. Mrs. Harrington poured coffee with her usual self-possessed efficiency. "How is Clara?" she asked, as one might ask about the weather to a person who has been outside. "Recovering from the excitement, I hope." "She is well," Miss Marple said. "Marriage becomes her. Gentleness suits gentleness." I had wondered. She set her cup down, letting the silver spoon ring very softly. Whether I might ask about the veil's history. Such pieces collect stories the way hedges collect burrs. Mrs. Harrington's mouth did not tighten quite enough to be noticed by an ordinary observer. "Family things do have associations," she allowed. "It is Harrington lace. My grandmother's, then my sister's. And before that—" Miss Marple's tone was as light as steam. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity. I have a fondness for genealogies. One learns a great deal from the small crossings in a family pattern." Mrs. Harrington glanced toward the window, as if considering whether the day warranted patience. When she spoke, her voice was level. "Before that, it was made for a cousin who married in haste before her husband went abroad. Youth. There were complications. The marriage did not endure as it should. The veil came back to the family. It is better put to respectable use than left in a drawer to sour." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Life seldom arranges itself to suit drawers. Then, as if remarking on a hem, "It had, I think, once a little ornament on the coronet. A charm, perhaps. There is the faintest impression where something lay, removed neatly, with a needle that knows its work." Mrs. Harrington's eyes moved, at last, to Miss Marple's. They were handsome eyes. They had persuaded many committees to the proper conclusion. "It is a plain coronet now. Brides have become fanciful, cluttering themselves with trinkets. My sister's taste is simpler. The thing made a bump." "A bump does draw the eye," Miss Marple said, "and eyes are unmanageable at weddings." She took a sip of coffee and let it be, because the trick with women like Mrs. Harrington was never to pull. It was to let their own desire for order bring them to the edge. On her way home, she called at the vicarage. It was an errand of pure listening. The housemaid, already fond of confiding in the old lady who never made her feel silly for having hands that smelled of brasso, mentioned that Mrs. Harrington had come twice in the week before the wedding, on business to do with forms, and once asked to see the parish register of banns from before the war, if you please. That was odd, the girl admitted, but she had not the habit of asking why when ladies spoke as if why belonged to them by right. "The parish register lives in a drawer that sticks. Mr. Lyle, fetched to open it, had muttered that people were fond of digging up what ought to be left under neat turf. Digging, Miss Marple knew, produces more than worms. It was enough for one day. She went home to her fire and her knitting, and the sound of the village passing her window. In the evening, when the lamps were lit, she examined the card again, the one that had been pushed under the Winfields' door. The letters were square and tidy, the downstrokes made with a fountain pen of good nib. She lifted the hymn book to her lap, turned to the inside cover where someone had inscribed the number for Whitsuntide in a firm, tidy hand, and thought about similarities. She would not have sworn in a court. One never can with such things, but one can know in one's bones. The next day brought proof in its proper form, which is to say not a dramatic discovery, but a small missing thing in a place where everything had its place. Clara came to tea with her mother, who had begun, at last, to look like a woman whose daughter's troubles might stop short of her pillow. Over seed cake, Clara drew from her reticule something wrapped in tissue. "I think this belonged to the veil once," she said, looking apologetically at her mother, as if she had broken a rule. "The housemaid found it under the hall runner when we were putting things away. I don't know how it came there." The tissue opened to reveal a tiny gold charm, no bigger than a sixpence, oval and worn smooth on one side. On the other, in a hand older than fashion, were engraved two initial letters twined together in an old-fashioned wreath. E and G. There was at the top a little ring that would have accommodated a stitch, and along its rim, caught in the join, was a hair of thread the colour of pale honey. "How pretty," Mrs. Winfield said, puzzled. "But not ours." "No," Miss Marple said, and her voice was very gentle. "It is Harrington. It was removed, I think, when the veil was made over for respectable use. But it strayed, as little things do when people are busy with big ideas. May I keep it a day?" Clara agreed at once. Miss Marple wrapped it again, and when mother and daughter had gone, she sat a long while without moving. The letters E and G went round in her head like a quiet bell. E for Eleanor, perhaps, or Edith. G for grey, or green. It hardly mattered who the girl had been. What mattered was the logic that had guided a careful hand. Remove the mark of a past that did not suit. Stitch the present to one's liking. Call it propriety. It was, she thought, not very different from putting a veil in a coal shed if one wished people to find it. One way says, "Do not look." The other, "Look here." Both, in their manner, are arrangements. There is a right time with arrangements to put a finger to them and see what gives. It came for Miss Marple on Friday, when Mrs. Harrington sent a note asking whether Miss Marple could assist with an inventory for the church. "Linen, we are always so much obliged for your good sense with hem-stitches," and proposing they do it together over a quiet hour. Miss Marple accepted. Quiet hours have a way of being noisier than they seem. They sat at a long table in the vestry with the linen spread before them, counting corporals and purificators, folding, noting small mendings to be done. Miss Marple spoke of nothing but linen until the pile had diminished to a manageable neatness. She allowed the silence that follows a task well done to settle, then drew from her pocket the little tissue parcel and set it between them. "How curious," she said conversationally, "that this should come to hand the day after we spoke. Did you ever know a village where objects overhear and present themselves?" Mrs. Harrington looked at the parcel as one looks at a wasp that has alighted on a jam pot. "What is it?" "A trifle," Miss Marple said, opening it to show the gold. "Once attached, I think, to the veil's coronet. It bears a memory of someone's letters. E and G, Mrs. Harrington's face did not change. That was, in itself, a change. She had the air of a woman who has drawn herself up to her full height without moving." "You take an interest in old fripperies, Miss Marple." "I have lived long enough," Miss Marple said, "to know that fripperies are where people hide what they are not brave enough to say aloud." She paused only a heartbeat. "I think, my dear, that you did not wish that charm, those vows if you like, to be part of your son's wife's day. I think you tried, decently in your way, to prevent it, and when decency did not work, something harder was attempted by another hand. Two hands on the same rope make it pull very tight." For a long moment there was no sound but the small ticking of the vestry clock. Then Mrs. Harrington said, in a voice that had been scrubbed of feeling, "The veil is Harrington property. It ought not to carry the name of a girl who did not know how to keep a promise." "And yet it did carry her mark all the same," Miss Marple said softly. "We none of us know how far our marks go. Your card, oh, do not trouble. There is no one here to prosecute you for anonymous propriety, was crueler than you intended. The other things were not yours. You are too proud to pin ribbons in the dark. But pride can make a person half blind, and then others use the dark you do not see." Mrs. Harrington's hand went to the silver scissors, not to take them up, but as if to hold them still. "You think me a villain." Miss Marple smiled, and there was nothing unkind in it. "I think you a mother, and a tower, as I once said, which sometimes casts a shadow where it does not mean to. Towers are good for warning ships. They are not good for roses." The smallest, saddest breath escaped the other woman. It was not surrender. It was something older, a yielding to truth the way a stiff fabric yields to the heat, of an iron. "Eleanor Gray," she said at last. "My cousin. Foolish, then wronged. The veil came back with marks that could not be washed. I would not have that over my son's bride. And so you took away what you could see," Miss Marple said, touching the little charm with her fingertip. "But not what you could not. That is the difficulty with history." Mrs. Harrington sat very straight. "What will you do with it?" "Return it to you," Miss Marple said simply, folding the tissue again and settling it on the table nearer the scissors than to herself. "It belongs where you say it does, but I think," and here her gentle voice firmed just enough to count, "that you might also, in time, tell Clara some kindly version of the truth. It is better to know that a shadow comes from something with a name than to live with shapes one cannot make out." Mrs. Harrington looked at the parcel. "You presume a great deal." "I observe a great deal," Miss Marple corrected, and patted the linen as if it were a child's hand. "It is my only accomplishment left." She left the vestry with the sense, not of victory, but of a knot loosened. 2 hands had indeed been on the rope. One had pulled from pride and fear of contamination, the other from vanity and malice. Between them, a girl had been bruised who had done nothing but prepare to marry. It would not do to leave the second hand unremarked. On her way home, she passed the tea shop window and saw Lydia inside, turning a cup idly with one finger, staring through the glass as if the village were a theatre in which the scene had stuck. A minute later, Miss Marple's path took her by the Institute, where Mrs. Denholm stood on the step with a ledger in her arms. "Funny thing," Mrs. Denholm called as Miss Marple went by. "Miss Grant came to return a key this morning." She laughed shortly. "A key I hadn't lent." "People do like to tidy up after a play," Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Mrs. Denholm, and walked on. In her parlour, she lit the lamp and drew her knitting nearer. Patterns, once seen, require finishing. One does not leave a row half done. Tomorrow, perhaps, would be the day to draw the threads together, where they could be seen and not merely felt. A quiet tea, a handful of women, a ribbon for the talk to run along. She would not shame anyone. She would, as always, correct a hem so that it hung straight. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its familiar evening, a cart on the lane, a child called in from the cold, the church clock declaring the hour. In kitchens and parlours, stories adjusted themselves, as stories do when new facts have been sewn into their edges. Miss Marple, counting stitches, thought of Clara's veil hanging in a wardrobe, whole enough for purpose, and of a small gold charm whose letters were, after all, only letters. It was time, she felt, to let them rest where they belonged. The next day would see the last of it, if people could be helped to their best selves. And if not, well, she had lived long enough to know. There is always another way to unpick a seam. Miss Marple's plan for the following afternoon was, like most of her plans, wrapped in the appearance of something entirely ordinary. She sent out 3 quiet invitations for tea, Mrs. Winfield, Mrs. Harrington and Lydia Grant, worded so plainly that none could claim surprise at the gathering. The note merely said she had a small matter to set straight and the kettle on. She knew very well that all 3 women, for different reasons, would be too curious to refuse. The table was laid with a care that looked casual. A plain linen cloth, her good Crown Derby teacups, and the seed cake everyone liked well enough to take a second slice of. The fire was bright, the air scented with tea leaves warming in the pot. When Mrs. Winfield arrived first, Miss Marple sat her in the chair near the hearth and began innocuous talk about the weather and the vicar's latest sermon. Mrs. Harrington followed, punctual and composed, her gloves neatly folded into her bag. Lydia was the last, a few minutes late, with a light apology and a glance round the room that took in every detail. They began as most village teas did, with remarks on gardens, committee work, and the small difficulties of getting good eggs this time of year. Miss Marple let the conversation run its harmless course until the cups were half empty, then reached for the small envelope on the side table. "I came across something," she said mildly, "that I think belongs in a family's keeping, though how it strayed is a mystery in itself." She opened the envelope and tipped the little gold charm into her palm. It was found after the wedding, caught under a hall runner. It once hung, I believe, from the coronet of the Harrington Vale. Mrs. Winfield leaned forward to look, puzzled but polite. Lydia's brows arched slightly in curiosity. Mrs. Harrington's eyes rested on it without flicker. "E and G," Miss Marple went on softly. "The initials are older than the present generation, of course. It is a pretty thing, and a mark of its time. I thought it might be right for it to be returned where it began." She extended her hand toward Mrs. Harrington, whose fingers closed over the charm with a small, deliberate motion. "How interesting that it should be found now," Mrs. Harrington said evenly. "One wonders how it came to be underfoot." "One does," Miss Marple agreed. "Objects travel, sometimes on their own, sometimes with a little help. Rather like pieces of lace." She turned her gaze to Lydia, whose lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Still chasing the story of the veil?" Lydia said lightly. "It must be almost as well-travelled as that charm." "Oh, I think the veil has had enough journeys," Miss Marple replied. "It was in the coal shed, it was in the repairer's workroom, and it was, very briefly, in the keeping of people who meant it harm. A great many hands touched it. Some meant to mend, some to unsettle. Sometimes," she added gently, "those two impulses come from the same place." Mrs. Winfield looked between them, her expression tightening. "Do you mean to say—" "I mean," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but carrying, "that Clara's wedding day was nearly overshadowed by a series of small acts, anonymous messages, hidden scraps, tokens left to be found. Each might have been dismissed alone, but together they were meant to plant doubt where it could do the most harm." Lydia's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think I think," Miss Marple interrupted, "that cleverness sometimes tempts people into games that they imagine are harmless. A ribbon tied at night, a piece of lace in a hedge. Such things speak to some temperaments. But there was more than one hand at work here. The message on the card, for instance, was not yours. The letters, the pen, the turn of phrase, those belonged to someone else entirely, someone with a different stake in the matter." She let her eyes rest briefly on Mrs. Harrington. Mrs. Harrington's chin lifted. "I wished only to protect what is ours. The veil is a Harrington piece. It ought to stand for what is respectable." "And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you removed what you thought did not belong. The charm, the history it carried, these were things you preferred unseen. But once a story is disturbed, it makes space for others to add to it. And another hand did add to it, in ways you would not have countenanced if you had known." Lydia gave a small laugh, though it lacked the confidence it once had. "And here we are, all three of us, as if in the last act of some drawing-room play. You've arranged it very neatly, Miss Marple." "Neatness," Miss Marple said, "is very like justice, best done without untidiness left behind." She poured more tea, as though the matter were nothing more than the mending of a hem. "I should like us all to agree that Clara's day, whatever private feelings may have existed beforehand, will not be revisited in talk. She is a bride now, and words can be as sharp as scissors if they're used without care." For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire. Mrs. Winfield was the first to speak, her voice firm. "Clara will hear nothing from me that isn't kind." Mrs. Harrington inclined her head. "Nor from me. I see," she added, in a tone that admitted more than it wished, "that certain measures have consequences one does not foresee. Lydia's smile was quick, almost defiant. And I suppose I'm to sit in a corner and be good. Only, Miss Marple said pleasantly, if you want to remain in the corner you've put yourself in. People forget such things in time, if given no reason to remember them. Lydia's gaze held hers for a heartbeat. Then she gave a small shrug, as if conceding that this was, for the moment, the better part of sense. When the tea was over and the three women had gone their separate ways, Miss Marple tidied the cups with her usual unhurried precision. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, the village sliding toward the quiet of evening. She felt, as she often did after such conversations, neither triumph nor victory, but the relief of having set a picture straight in its frame. Later, as she sat with her knitting, she thought about how near the whole business had come to spoiling something that ought to have been untouched. Human nature, she reflected, is rarely content to leave a fine piece of lace alone. Someone will always wish to cut, to add, to make their own mark. But it can also be coaxed back toward decency, if one is willing to take the time to untangle the threads. In the weeks that followed, the veil was mentioned only in passing, and then with the sort of fond exaggeration that time lends to any village story. Clara and Michael settled into married life with the cautious happiness of people still finding their rhythm. Mrs. Harrington attended to her committees, more exacting than ever, but a shade less given to pronouncements. Lydia reappeared in the tea shop and at the institute, her manner as bright as before, though the glances she exchanged across a room were shorter, more measured. Miss Marple knew better than to think the lesson permanent. People change in moments and then change back just as easily. But for now, the air in St. Mary Mead felt lighter, and that was enough. She placed the last row of stitches on her needle, glanced at the small stack of mending waiting beside her chair, and thought, with a faint smile, that there is a certain satisfaction in finishing a pattern exactly as it ought to end. The winter months slid gently into spring, and with them the sharp edges of the veil affair wore down into something softer in the village memory. Those who had been close to it retained their own versions, each coloured by what they wished to see, and those on the periphery were content to let it settle into the general store of St. Mary Mead anecdotes, somewhere between the year the church roof fell in and the time Mrs. Price Ridley's hat caught fire at the harvest supper. Clara and Michael found their footing together, as Miss Marple had quietly expected they would once the shadow was lifted. Clara's shy reserve gave way to a calm assurance. Michael's protective watchfulness softened into partnership. When Miss Marple passed them in the lane, they always stopped to exchange a word, and the young bride's smile was now genuine, reaching her eyes without effort. Mrs. Harrington, for her part, never referred directly to the events, but there was a discernible shift in her manner. Her control of committees remained unchallenged, but she had acquired the habit, small yet telling, of pausing before she spoke on matters of propriety, as though weighing not just the rule but the effect of its application. Miss Marple considered this a reasonable outcome. Some people do not change their nature, but they may, with a little nudge, alter their angle to the light. Lydia Grant's re-emergence into village life was quieter than her comings and goings had once been. She still had the bright hat, the ready smile, the touch of charm that made her welcome company, but she no longer moved quite so freely across the social field. There were glances exchanged, of course, and knowing smiles when she passed, but her audience was smaller. Even she seemed to understand that some stories, once told too loudly, linger in ways that make new performances harder to stage. The veil itself hung now in the Winfields' wardrobe, carefully wrapped in tissue, the coronet's plain ribbons still in place. The charm with its E and G had been returned to the Harrington family, at Miss Marple's gentle insistence, and stored away in a drawer where, one hoped, it might rest undisturbed. Only Miss Marple knew how close that little object had come to being the thread on which the whole day unravelled. On a mild afternoon in April, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the green take on its first true blush of spring. Peter Lyle, lankier by an inch since Christmas, passed with his bicycle and waved. Somewhere behind the church, the bell ringers were practicing. Their notes floated up and away, untroubled. She thought of all the small things that had been set in motion: a borrowed key, a snip of scissors, the tying of a ribbon, and how, in the right or wrong hands, such trifles could steer the course of lives. It was, she reflected, never the grand dramatic gestures that most endangered happiness, but the quiet interferences, the little arrangements made under the cover of seeming harmlessness. And it was these, more than anything, that she had made it her business to notice. She did not dwell on the matter with satisfaction. There was no thrill in it, only the knowledge that a tangle had been carefully, if not completely, smoothed. Others might not see the joins where the mending had been done, but she did, and she was content with the work. As the bells changed to a lighter peal, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the wool soft and warm under her fingers. Patterns, she knew, always repeated themselves, whether in lace, in gardens, or in human behaviour. And when they did, she would be ready, as always, to see them for what they were, and to unpick the knot before it tightened beyond repair. For in St. Mary Mead, as in the wider world, there were always more veils to be lifted, and more stories waiting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right eyes to see.